Palier ce que je touchais. Le truc qui inverse les mains. Non, c'est ce que je touchais.
To briefly recapitulate our study of Sri Aurobindo's Life Divine, we were in the chapter titled The Evolution of the Spiritual Man, where Sri Aurobindo describes the emergence of the spiritual being out of the mental being that we currently are, and in order to be able to participate consciously in this emergence, the next step in human evolution, he turns sight back to what brought us here. For the bulk of our evolution so far has been by nature, conscious human effort. And he says we have to understand what nature tried to do and how far we have come in order to be able to build on what has been done so far. He points out that nature takes four broad streams of development in order to deepen the human consciousness to its spiritual inner ranges. The first line is through religion, the second through occultism, the third through spiritual philosophy, and the fourth is through the direct experience. And then he takes up these four, one after another, showing how not only each nourishes the other, but each is also somehow implied, involved in the other in some way. And so although we make these four broad streams distinct for our study, we understand also how they mix into each other. In the portion that we are at now, he gave a first summary of how religion unfolds. We saw the important stages through which it passes, where it fails in its claims, and what is the truth behind its premature claims to divine authority or absoluteness of its inspiration or light. But he also shows how the unfolding of the evolutionary stages inevitably must begin with a lower grade of an instinctive sense of the infinite or the invisible around, and then develops through many stages, creating its own forms and relationships with the invisible, trying to utilize those invisible powers for life. And while this stage has a instinctive, intuitive mix, very soon nature pushes forward to developing the intellect. And with the superstructure of the intellect, these lower forms and instincts and intuitions often are suffocated or even removed entirely. And that's where religion must break away, or rather, occult knowledge breaks away from religion, as does spiritual philosophy, direct mystical experience. But eventually, when this superstructure of the intellect fails to fulfill its need, the mind turns once again to what it had rejected in religion, but now from a higher poise, a more rational approach, touching things which are infra-rational, but there is a supra-rational opening to a purer intuition, which can recognize the true elements and give to them new forms, which lead to a more spiritual awakening of that religious impulse. That was the broad structure he described. And as we saw, this is something universal. It is inevitable in the very nature of evolution that these stages are passed through anywhere in the universe. But now, in the passage we are at, he turns this gaze to our Earth's past, looking for evidence of this line of natural evolution. And although the earlier stages are hidden from us, he looks at the mass of animism, fetishism, magic, totemism, taboo, myth, superstitious symbol, etc., and the emergence of these in a primitive form, highly mixed with the littleness of life and its priorities. And the invisible aspect of nature often has an occult dimension, but which is led by vital intuitions, and the lower vital intuitions, which have a coarseness, and opening to small life powers and elemental beings, with the sole purpose of satisfying the small life desires and the crude physical world. Even where the cultures have become defined, the religions themselves have become more developed, little pockets remain where this kind of a small shamanic or lower life and elemental contact is still present. We have in India, for example, the distinction made between the great diviner beings and the small powers attached to little pockets of a lake or a pond, or even attached to a village. There's the village deity and so on, whose sole concern is the well-being of that little village. And all these, he says, primitive forms need not be the first beginning what we see, or they are rather, he says, a relapse from a higher knowledge belonging to a previous cycle of civilization, or debased remnants of an obsolete culture. That's the beginning, the first stage of the formation of religion. And it was followed after whatever stages by a more advanced type of religion, of which we have a record in the literature of surviving documents of the early civilized peoples. What is seen in these documents, he says, is this type composed of a polytheistic belief and worship, a cosmology, complexes of ceremonies, practices, ritual, ethical obligations, interwoven sometimes deeply into the social system. Was ordinary or nationally or tribal religion intimately expressive of the stage of evolution and life reached by the community. That is, every community as it emerges now develops these into forms relevant to its current stage of evolution. And so we have to understand, although the religious form or template may be common, taking an organized religion which has a mass following across many countries, the template may be common, the actual form, values and priorities which you see in different cultures or sub-communities of cultures can be completely different, adapted to their current stage of evolution and their current need. I want to share here an experience because it is still fresh. I was last week in a space in Orissa where we had a meeting for a special, and I recall seeing a mix of many different kinds of forms. There were people who would go into the meditation hall, sit in concentration and meditation, perhaps immersed in something deep, oblivious even to the physical circumstances. There were others who were fixating on a particular form or a particular photo. There were some who were too busy repeating a mantra to even notice what they were doing, and the whole body was moving mechanically. There were others with various other focuses. Somebody takes an incense, someone wants to flower, someone wants to do the thing which corresponds to him as his way of relating to the spiritual presence. And many variations like this. And I was wondering, my first instinct was to say, well, why is such a clutter of different forms? And I had this very interesting perception which came spontaneously, that when the infinite descends to meet humanity, each one receives with the container that is him, his consciousness, his personality. And seen from above, from the perspective of the infinite, there is nothing wrong in any form. Because that is for that container the way it can receive the infinite, within its finiteness, within its shape, within its priority, within its current state of conscious evolution. And rather than concerning oneself with what may appear cruder or lesser forms in which people may relate to the divine, we should recognize rather the fact that they are receiving the pouring in of the infinite, and it helps them grow in their relation with the divine. And that's all that matters. See rather the infinity which is filling the finite. And then all forms are acceptable as long as they help you grow. This is the idea which he gives here, that it is expressive of the stage of evolution of thought and life reached by the community. The emphasis, though, here in Sri Aurobindo's, the passage we are reading here, is the collective form, within which there may be individual variations. But each collective, each community equally becomes as if a vessel or a container, when the infinite fills humanity as a whole. There is the individual vessel and then there is the collective vessel. In the collective phase of evolution, there may be variations on an individual level, but still the collective itself may be either still at a largely sentimental stage of development, or may have developed its intellectual aspect to the detriment of its sentiment, or maybe one where the struggle is to unify the intellectual form and the sentimental experience, or there may be a priority in a particular space which is much more physical, while elsewhere the priority will be much more ethical. And each, therefore, as a collective container, receives and modifies. It's interesting to see how, when Christianity took form in Europe, spreading through at first a very militant form, each culture, each space developed its own variant, its own priority. And then they ended up fighting each other because their forms were different. And so there were centuries of struggle between different branches and variants of the common teaching, common book, common name through which they were still accessing what would have been originally something very central. But when they moved to the American continent, they decided that it did not work for them to be fighting each other. They were in a minority. The people living there were in a majority. So a compact was made in which they said, as long as you follow the Bible and you speak of Jesus, we will not fight each other. And anyone who doesn't follow the Bible and Jesus is our enemy. And so they formed this tolerance of each other's variations against what they saw as a common enemy which had to be converted. And something of that remained subsequently. And so what you see, unlike in Europe where the divisions are much stronger, in America, in Northern America, you do not find them fighting in the same way. And yet the distinctions are so great that one will not mix with another. And that's where you see how the religious tradition mixes with the community values and the community identity. So the religious, the ritual and ethical obligations interwoven sometimes deeply into the social system. And at some point you cannot separate the two anymore. The religion and the society are so deeply interwoven. The structures of society themselves are as if defined by their religious forms. In the outer structure, we still miss the support of a deeper spiritual significance, but this gap was filled in the greater, more developed cultures by a strong background of occult knowledge and practices, or else by carefully guarded mysteries with the first element of spiritual wisdom and discipline. So this being now this form in which the religion has been spreading, obviously the focus is on its outer forms, social forms, and the rituals, practices, ceremonies, mythology, cosmology, ways of worship. What you're missing then is the deeper spiritual significance. What happens to that? Because you're busy telling people what they should do in their practice. We see, for example, in India, when the evangelical groups come to convert, they will go to various houses, introduce little icons of Christ, or if they find that the culture is much more worshipping of the mother aspect of the divine, then they will bring in icons of Mary carrying baby Christ and say, you have so many forms of deity, but this is one more, and this is actually more powerful. You will see, you will get good luck. And for a culture which has not, especially in the extremes of the tribal spaces, where the intellectual power has not been so developed, the heart is open, they say, all right, why not? And then after a while, the same preacher will come and say, throw out the others, they're inferior, they're false ones, this is the only true one. And apparently, some of the stories we heard were quite surprising. They would say, try this as an experiment, pray to this one, ask for money, and see what happens. And next day, they would leave a packet of money at the door of the person. And then come and say, see, you got the gift from God, and this is the true God. It was enough to sway a certain group that was not too thinking. They would take the idol of Ganesh, which was made in stone, throw it in water, and then take the cross made of wood and throw it in water and say, the cross floats, therefore it's more powerful. Now, it may sound, for those of us who are more rationally trained, it may sound surprising, but it works in a culture which has not developed rationality, especially among the forest dwellers and the tribal isolated groups. And the focus then is on the form. There is nothing of the teaching which is coming in. Follow this form, not that form. And then with this form is an associated book or a certain practice, and that's all you've done, you've converted them. If you think about how ridiculous it feels, if you consider the true sense of religion, they've completely lost that. All their stuff is in forms, and there's often behind it a political agenda, because now you answer to a central authority, which is the church or whatever else. And the church will say, now you have to start tithing 10% of your earnings you give to the church. And the whole thing sounds like a business. The church has a project called the Joshua Project, where they list every house in India, down to the house number. and mark them whether they have been converted or they are ripe for conversion. And it's available on a website. You can see it and see what you are marked as by them. And it's shared across many of these evangelical groups. They may fight each other in their own home domain, but here they have again this common objective. And it's like a business, as a multinational would, to convert you to buy their product. And exactly the same strategy is the same thought. And when you look at all that, where is the spiritual content? You do not see it. And for a culture where the spiritual was more valuable, the form being changed may seem to be irrelevant. But very soon in the second generation or the third generation, the spiritual content is lost and the form becomes now the cause for conflict and division. Everywhere that the conversions were made, the groups that were converted were then taught to cut away from other groups, separate in their festivals and so on. But what you see is so full of the superficial, the outer structure, we miss the support of a deeper spiritual significance. This gap was filled in the greater, more developed cultures by a strong background of occult knowledge and practices. So you will find when, not everywhere, where the culture has grown more, you will find going to a religious ritual, you experience something. You go to a Vedic Havana, even if you've been brought up with a language, with the English language in the English medium, you do not know Sanskrit, you hear the resonance of the chant and something touches you. Or you're sitting there and as the practice proceeds, you feel a certain deep calm or warmth or a power, some impact which is there that makes you want to come back, because you can feel the difference in that space where the ritual was done and the space which is far away. You come back and you can feel the glow. Even after the ritual is over, for a day or two, sometimes up to 3 days, you can feel the glow of that presence. You move away, you do not have it. It's bound to that location where the prayer, the invocation was done. And it is the same with temples. I've shared elsewhere an experience I had with one of the temples. It is one of the Jyotirlingas, one of the forms, embodiments of Shiva as a pillar of light, 12 major ones in India. And I remember going to one of them recently, and it was a huge crowd, extremely uncomfortable, suffocating, and you are herded in, and this was in Varanasi, at the Jyotirlinga, you're herded in and there are people pulling you for attention, put money here, pray here, get your benefit by offering worship. And if you offer money, then they pull you aside, allow you to stay longer, and I refused to do that. As I walked around, I was pushed out, there were several of us. We turned to the point where we could see inside the sanctum sanctorum, the Jyotirlinga, and in the moment where the sight touched, there was as if a flash of light. As I avoided that, I moved out of the line and stayed longer. Nothing more. It had done its thing, and it didn't need to do more. I stayed longer. Nothing. The light was there, and the work was done. It was doing others to whatever extent, and the work was done. It was doing others to whatever extent people registered it, and so I moved on. It's a very different experience from other spaces, other temples where you go in and then you feel the presence filling you, building and intensifying. And the longer you stay, the more it grows. And after a while, it's too much. You need to assimilate, so you leave. And I don't know whether it was specific to that space or whether it was because of the herding and the chaos and confusion around that prevented the deeper build-up. But this element of the occult knowledge or practice which conserves the power and builds and renews it is at the core of many of the temple traditions. You will see it in the Catholic Christianity. You will see it in the Catholic Christianity, in the rituals which are taught, which are transmitted. The priest has to be celibate. One of the reasons why the Catholic tradition will not allow priests to marry. You will find the same pattern in India where the priests marry. You will find the same pattern in India where the priests are celibate, and they have to maintain a state of purity because they are the agents by which a certain power is invoked or built up. And the idea is in many temples that every 12 years they have to purify the presence which is invoked because it gets covered up with all the dross that the devotees bring. And the method of purification is an occult ritual. The priest himself does not have to be of a high spiritual development. He has only to know what is to be done with a basic purity internally. And that's enough to invoke that power. I can share again this, I might have done it before, but long ago, when they had a ceremony here for the Ganesh temple, and they had set up a huge structure. There were 4 sections corresponding to the 4 Vedas, and there was one section which they were building the powers of Ganesh. There were many different Havana kundas, the centers for the fire which is lit, of different shapes. And in each, it was as if an aspect of power of Ganesh was invoked. And I asked the priest to explain the mechanism of it. He says this one transfers into the next, and the last comes to this pot of water. I said, what's holding it? He said, it's the water in the container which is holding the power, which is assembling as if the different parts or powers of Ganesh. And at that time, he is complete. And it is with this that we transfer it to the idol. I said, how do you transfer it? And he said, we take it on our head, and we walk up to there, and then we transfer by pouring the water into the idol. And I asked him, what does it feel like when you do this? And there were 2 of them, the head priest and his assistant. They looked at each other and smiled knowingly. And then the head priest said, it feels as if a sun is lit up in your heart. The brightness of the power, the intensity of it. And he says, you forget who you are. You have no control over yourself. It is the power of Ganesha that now leads you. And depending on what he chooses, he may walk any way towards the temple, he may go around, he may wander around. It's his choice. You are no more conscious of yourself. But this experience of the sun lit up within you is not done by the person's spiritual development. It's a power that is gathered and built up, held in a container, a whole technology. And this is what we will call the occult knowledge and practice. And the transfer into the idol. Unlike a spiritual invocation, which is of a completely different kind. A spiritual installation is done by a spiritually founded person, someone who lives in the divine consciousness. And he establishes the idol and invokes the divine presence and fixes it, and it's done. No ritual, no mantra, no procedure, no technology required. The direct experience in which you live is now as if infused and embedded and fixed in the physical space. And this is an experience I had in the Ramakrishna Math in Belur Math in Calcutta. The first time that I went there, I sat before the statue of Ramakrishna Paramahansa, and there's a glass sheet that separates the public from that sanctum sanctorum. And sitting there, looking at it, you felt a profound presence. But suddenly, as the eyes were gazing on the idol, suddenly there was a sense as if the idol is conscious. And then as if I could see the idol breathing, the chest softly breathing, and the eyes blinking, as if the face smiling. And it was a conscious, living idol and presence. And I was surprised. Afterwards, going around, I came to the museum where they had the quotations placed, where it was recorded that Ramakrishna Paramahansa had promised Swami Vivekananda. He said, wherever you will install me, I will be present. And this particular idol was installed by Swami Vivekananda. What did he do? Did he need rituals? Did he need to go through so many havanas and processes? Nothing. He established it and invoked the presence, and that was all that's needed. When you look at a space such as the Matri Mandir, consider that before the Matri Mandir was built, it was just a barren piece of land, desert. Some go inside, it looks pretty, you don't feel a presence. But in this particular case, the mother made the promise. She said, build the Matri Mandir, and I take it upon myself to make it one of the most powerful centers on earth. And so, as it was built, you could feel the presence growing. Once the inner chamber was built, you could feel something beginning to accumulate. And when the crystal was set, suddenly there was a surge in the presence growing. And even though the outer layers were not completed, going inside you could feel the power growing. And year to year it was growing. As the structure is completed, the power grows more. Until at its completion, the power is now full. And she made another comment, and this was regarding the life in Auroville. She said, the sooner your consciousness impacts everybody living in that space, naturally builds, therefore, a deeper collective container, of which this is the soul and center and physical representation. There are spaces where you do not have an obvious physical center of the spirit. And inevitably, I found something eventually becomes representative of that spiritual soul. And it's interesting to see that almost like a being, like a person, just as in our physical consciousness, whatever our body shape, within us, there is a divine presence which becomes even represented in a physical space. We generally feel it deep within in the heart center. Something like that tends to happen in the collective also. But it did not need any occult process or procedure. The engineering people built their part, people came and cleaned up the place, installed the things. Nobody came and said, I will invoke. It was done directly by the mother's presence, working from the spiritual poise on a subtler plane, directly working on the physical. But in a sense, it was her promise, spiritual consciousness. It renews itself the moment you begin to respect it. You do not need any rituals for cleansing. You do not need any purificatory rituals of any kind, as in a normal temple, where the primary mechanism for invoking the spiritual power is a cult. And this is the fundamental difference between a spiritual center, or a spiritually installed presence, and an occultly installed presence. In the occult invocation, because of the nature of the method, you may get a very powerful and effective outcome, but it is represented or it is limited to that which was invoked by the occult means. So if you invoked a certain aspect of the divine, as in this case the Ganesh, the aspect of Ganesh, well, that is what predominates. Elsewhere it may be Parvati, elsewhere it may be Shiva, or any other aspect of the divine. But when you go to a space which is primarily a spiritual installation, then the experience is very different. Each one going there seems to receive that which they are most open to. So when you sit in the Matra Mandir, there's no particular direction. As in a temple, you would say the gate of the temple has to face the east, or whatever form it takes. There's no particular direction which is important. You may sit all around it. And each one comes away with a different experience relevant to their need at that moment. So it is as if the consciousness which has been drawn in is the power of the infinite, meeting our finite containers and filling each according to our receptivity and capacity and need of that moment. So this is to explain the distinction of the occult knowledge and practice and its effect in the religion and the spiritual content, where you could actually discard with all of the forms, not only of the religion but even of the occult. It doesn't need any of it. But he's speaking here of this occult knowledge and practices, or else by carefully guarded mysteries with the first element of spiritual wisdom and discipline. So this brings us closer to what we are speaking of. Carefully guarded mysteries. And why is it called a mystery? Because it is not understandable to the limited mind. You are entering a domain where you enter inside and you perceive something wonderful. But it does not stop with that. You go deeper and you find something even deeper, and you go still deeper and it is still deeper. depending on how deep you are able to go, it seems to reveal layers and layers, and therefore it is a mystery, it is concealed, it is hidden, and often hidden in many layers. So carefully guarded mysteries. Why do you need to guard it? Who guards it? We'll speak of that shortly. With the first element of spiritual wisdom and discipline. And so there you have often in the temple tradition, for example, the priesthood will have something of this. First element of spiritual wisdom and discipline, and not necessarily always everywhere. I had occasion to meet a priest in Orissa who was a priest in a temple of Devi, goddess, I don't remember which aspect. And he said to me, like all priests, I didn't believe in God. And I was doing my rituals and I used to think, well, is there really this presence? Is there this deity? And then one day he says, I decided I want to have an experience of her. I want a darshan, vision of her. Revelation would be a more appropriate word. And so he said, okay, what do I do for this? So he began to follow a series of practices. Whatever he could, he knew of, either he was taught. I asked him a little bit of what he did. There were certain practices of meditation and breathing and so on. And I said, well, what happened then? And then he started narrating something. I said, something else, which was to do with the work he was doing. I said, but did you have the darshan? He said, yes, I got that. How was it? It was in dream that she appeared before him when he had the vision. But it was a dream experience. Obviously, it was powerful enough to satisfy his heart. And then he said he continued his rituals, but now with the faith and the living character of the experience. But it was interesting to see how, today, of course, what we see is a degenerate condition. The priestly class is given a certain knowledge, a discipline, and perhaps an element of philosophy or wisdom associated with that, but not everybody takes the trouble. And if they don't, then they may not have an experience. But if they do, then they have a means by which they can develop that first, he says, first element of spiritual wisdom and discipline, but by carefully guarded mysteries. So he was given, or at least he had only a very rudimentary kind of knowledge of how to purify himself and prepare himself. He also mentioned fasting and other practices which refined or purified his consciousness. You will find many such kinds of practices common in the priestly traditions across the world, across religions. But what is not always obvious is they are often layered. And so there is the superficial layer of the priest that meets people. And he may have a basic practice which allows him to be of help. And then there will be the deeper gradation of the priests who do not meet the public, and they have something more. They will interface with this lay priests who will interface with the public. And it's as if they're guarding a certain power or a certain intensity of consciousness. And then there'll be someone else still deeper and still deeper. Not always obviously spiritual, but with an occult power generally. And at the core will be the person or the group that holds the fullness of what that lineage, that tradition, or that particular temple will have. And it's as if the layers outside become filters. So the lay priest who has just joined is given a basic practice. If he is competent enough, he is given the next layer practice. If he then becomes worthy of that, he goes to the next level. And perhaps eventually in his late age, he might become part of the core or not. So what you see is a filtration. You drop out people who are not competent, or you let them stay at the layer at which they are. They can't know that there are enough layers. Otherwise, so it's done by kind of a subtle selection, or sometimes controlled. There's so many layers. In the Freemason tradition, they speak of 33 levels. It's interesting. Why 33? And that would be the turn of the Kundalini, making this 2.5 is one of the ways. 3, they say, in some traditions. But 33 is more obviously the number of bones in your spinal column. If you think about the ascent of consciousness, and represented by, let's say, the Kundalini rising through 33 steps until it reaches the highest where it joins with the divine or with the cosmic consciousness. It's as if you're representing that stages of evolution in your layering or gradation. Many ways in which people do these things. The numbers often are symbolic in this sense. But the necessity for guarding is because we recognize that not everybody is competent to manage that deeper knowledge. Because especially where it is an occult power, you have great potential for misuse. An occult power, unlike a spiritual power, does not involve a change of your consciousness necessarily. So you may have the power, and if your ego is still somewhat strong, it may seize upon the power and misuse it. And therefore you have to go through many layers to ensure that your ego is sufficiently softened up and you will not misuse. And the moment someone is found to be unworthy, well, you stop them there or throw them out of the system. Unfortunately, what happens in time, and especially in the declining phase of the Yuga, there were not enough people who were willing to be selfless or of a certain degree of purity, and often it's a reflection of society around. And so what would often happen with many of these traditions is that at the last stage, your inner core is becoming smaller and smaller in numbers, and you have to admit the best available who may not have been good enough a few centuries ago, but now there is no one else. Or in current society's decline, it's the best and it's wonderful even. And you admit that. And very quickly the core itself begins to degrade. And this is the problem of such guarded mysteries. While they may hold the first element of spiritual wisdom and discipline, you will find eventually a decline and a corruption and eventually the loss of the power itself. As you see in many of the old sacred spaces, there is the tradition, for example, in Greece of Delphi, where the people were prepared through such a process of filtration. There was the core priestess who would be the one pure enough and worthy enough to receive some kind of a divine afflatus and speak on behalf of that. And once it went into decline, there was not only misuse, but all the clutter around of the shops selling their wares and things like that. And eventually the power was not strong enough to protect itself, and then comes the invasion which destroys everything. It's interesting that those who came to destroy it were so thorough that nothing at all remains. Even the stones they broke were scattered far away. And a drawing made of the destroyed space to be sent to the Pope to show him how thoroughly it has been destroyed. And one has to wonder what it represents. So much has been lost in this way from many of those lineages, but we have to recognize that many of them have already become corrupted. Often what was a spiritual center is now seized by the ego, and then it taps with the same power, with the same occult knowledge, lower powers, which satisfy desires, and then it becomes even the opposite of a spiritual center. So the carefully guarded layering was precisely to prevent this degradation, but in the very act of trying to prevent it, because the core knowledge is held by a few, when there is degeneration in the core, there is no way to correct for it. And Sri Aurobindo will speak of this in the next paragraph. Occultism occurs more often as an addition or superstructure, but is not always present. So the point was that the deeper spiritual significance being lost, there's a strong background of occult knowledge or guarded mysteries where something of this is protected. But this is often seen as an addition or superstructure, not always present. The worship of divine powers, sacrifice, the surface piety, and social ethics are the main factor. What do you see? The worship taking place. People go, offer worship, offer their coconuts, offer their flowers or money or whatever form. There's a sacrifice that takes place. You give something to the divine, various ways. Surface piety, one of the commonest criticisms of a priest in any religion will be, how can you do this being a priest? You told a lie, or you cheated someone, or you deceived. The moral behavior, the moral front is now extremely important. and social ethics. They will not either marry, or they will not drink alcohol or take drugs, or whatever it is that for them belongs, represents something inferior or negative. So we see how in the religion there is this occult component, and then next, a spiritual philosophy or idea of the meaning of life seems at first to be absent, but its beginnings are often contained in the myths and mysteries, and in one or two instances fully emerge out of them, so that it assumes a strong separate existence. You will see this in the Abrahamic traditions in a particular manner, where the meaning of life seems to be to prepare for an afterlife, very common to that space. You will see this in other traditions, where the meaning of life is to, in the Vedanta, one of the later Vedantic traditions, the meaning of life is to get free from ignorance or get beyond suffering, as in the Buddhist tradition. Very few retain the idea that the meaning of life is to realize and manifest the divine. That is sometimes held or comes up as a glimmer in many of the religious traditions. I've had fortunate occasion over the last 10 or 15 years to meet with people from a variety of religious traditions, and often representing the elite of those traditions. And I've always tried to see what represented for them the deepest or highest. And entering into their tradition, there was always somewhere a story of someone who spoke of life as the means of realizing the divine, or living the divine consciousness in life. Even in the most ascetic traditions, there was always someone who came at some point who tried to bring this truth. And I found this interesting because it's as if nature is preparing all the religious traditions for this dimension and pushing, nudging these things forward for a time when they will have to face it and make that transition. Otherwise, they will, as if, lose their force or their message. Only recently, I was called by an ascetic tradition within India, a very powerful, famous, and organized one. And the head of that said, the youth today is just not interested in spirituality, and by which he meant the ascetic, renouncing life. But we have to teach them that the true Hindu teaching is not just renunciation, but it is enjoyment of life in all the four phases. So implied was the idea that you go through three phases, and the fourth is the renunciation as an ascetic, without which you have not reached the true spirituality. But we have to teach them that there is enjoyment in the other three phases. And it was interesting to see how they had to compensate for the complete lack of interest in asceticism. They give examples of how up to a certain age the children are very happy to learn the sacred texts by heart, and then after that age of 13 or so, suddenly they lose all interest. And I said, to learn by heart or to do rituals is interesting up to that age because the intellect has not kicked in. The heart and the emotion are dominant, and you have the enjoyment of that experience. But once the intellect kicks in, you have to tap the need of the intellect. That's how you will get them to develop this. And at that point, the approach will be, rather than learning by heart the scripture, which was for them the form of the religion, I said you have to get them to question the scripture. Why does the scripture say this? Can you justify the opposite viewpoint? Have a debate over it. And then through a debate and a deepening of debate, the intellect may come to the recognition, yes, it makes sense. Or raise the same question without the scripture, let them come to a conclusion, and then show how the scripture actually articulated what they have come to as a conclusion. But you have to engage the power of mind. You cannot go against the evolutionary need. And so it was an interesting discussion, but it's not there in the normal thought process of the very ascetic traditions, that even to accept life and the growth of spiritual life, which is not ascetic, is something. Spiritual philosophy or idea of the meaning of life seems at first to be absent, but its beginnings are often contained in the myths and mysteries. And this is what you saw in the project. And that's why it was so necessary for those myths or for those people, even saints within those traditions, to plant those seeds. Then they can say, oh yes, 200 years ago we had a saint who actually said this. Yes, this is acceptable to us. This was again an actual example of one of the Abrahamic traditions. It was in the United States in a discussion we were on this. And the person said, yes, we have actually had 200 years ago a saint who spoke these terms and spoke of life being a domain for kingdom of God to be realized. And so, yes, we can accept this in our teaching. If that had not been there, no, what you're speaking is against the official teaching. We cannot accept those ideas. Philosophy has come forward so strongly that it even exists separately from the religious tradition. Again, we see that in India in a couple of examples where we have an entire lineage which teaches only the philosophy of Vedanta. And for them, meditation or deeper spiritual experience is not necessary. If you understand the Vedanta and can put that idea as your living practice, that's good enough. And so the spiritual philosophy becomes a thing in itself, separate from the religion, breaking away. Now, the next paragraph, he takes up this question of which came first. Is it in the religion that the occult dimension opens, or is it from the occult that the religion emerged? It is possible indeed that it is the mystic or the incipient occultist who was everywhere the creator of religion and imposed his secret discoveries in the form of belief, myth, and practice on the mass human mind. For it is always the individual who receives the intuitions of nature and takes the step forward, dragging or drawing the rest of humanity behind him. A very interesting statement here. So first he takes up the possibility that, yes, it could be that there was a mystic or someone who is on the verge of developing his occult experiences, or everywhere it was these who trigger or create the religion, impose his secret discoveries in the form of belief, myth, and practice on the mass human mind. I've just discovered that when I repeat 3 times with a certain intention, it tends to happen. Now, I have experienced it, and so I'm going to teach that and impose it on others. Very simple, because there's nothing else that I know. Obviously, in such a religion, the starting reference will be, this is the only way, there is no other way, because that's all I know. And why would this be justified? For it is always the individual who receives the intuitions of nature and takes the step forward. If you look at the collective mass, everywhere, in any community, on any scale, who gets the intuition first? An individual. You may say the intuition came on the entire mass, but did it come equally in all at the same time? That never happens. In the very movement of the descending action of the intuition, those who are most receptive will first touch. And after a while, others who are less receptive, and then others, and others, and others. And by the time it goes down to the general mass, perhaps the intuition would have been completely lost. So inevitably, it will always start with an individual, and then a few individuals, and then a few more, and then a few more. But the way he words this, for it is always the individual who receives the intuitions of nature, who is leading the journey, nature. You go back to the earlier discussions, we've come to this point again and again. He's showing you that this evolution has been the work of nature. She chose to build these 4 lines of development. She chose to take through these stages. She chose to accelerate the development of the intellect to the detriment of the early stages of the intuitive or instinctive vital intuitions. She then chose to integrate, and we see the prime driver of this first preparatory spiritual awakening being nature. And when she decides that this has to happen, it's going to happen. When she decides to hold back this development for developing something else, well, that's what's going to happen. Elsewhere, Sri Aurobindo explains how, while earlier the nature was pushing for the religious development everywhere, at some point she creates this gigantic bifurcation. In the East, she creates an exclusive spiritual development to the detriment of matter. In the West, she creates this exclusive development of matter to the loss of the spiritual, so that these two extremes can be taken to their exclusive exaggeration and then bringing the two together. But until she decides to bring them together, everybody will say, but this is what I want, I'm not interested in the other, depending on which side they're on. But in preparation for the bringing together, within both groups, she will keep these seed subgroups, and sometimes very isolated, who are preparing for that work that she's going to do later in bringing them together. So in Europe, you will find those who retain the deeper spiritual content in their own little traditions, pockets, isolated, never a part of the superstructure of religion. Or in the East, you will find those who are extremely materialistic and maintain the skill and the grip on matter, which is needed for the later reintegration. You will find today many people working within the Greek tradition now go back to certain roots of spirituality, of European spirituality, which didn't interest them earlier, but now suddenly they want to explore those and bring them back and revivify those streams. But when nature decides now is the time to mix the two, you'll find the bursting out in both groups and in the mixing of these two groups. Until then, they would not mix. If you tried to mix them, they would not. But when she decides, suddenly you'll find people yearning to cross boundaries and mix. And even, and this is the deeper spiritual way in which it is done, those who had developed the exaggerated spiritual aspect in the West now incarnate in the East, now incarnate in the West, and those who had mastered the material domain in the West incarnate in the East, and within those cultural contexts now try to complement their one-sided development and build a richer integration. And this crossing over is very interesting to observe. It happened particularly in the 60s and 70s in a very big way. There were people coming from the United States who would come to India, take Indian names, and go back and live more vividly the Indian yoga or religious traditions than even Indians in India. And they created their own little spaces, their own subgroups, which still are very much alive. And then that phase passed. Perhaps it was no more needed. But they became the precursors for that kind of integration. Now it is much more at the level of thought, not so much a living in the heart, not in the bhakti aspect, but in the aspect of the spiritual philosophy that this transfer is taking place. For it is always the individual who receives the intuitions of nature. She is pushing the intuitions. She decides, here I'm going to introduce this, and the best person available for it catches it. If he misses it, someone else gets it, the next best and the next best. Now this is true not only of the intuitions for the mystic, the occult, the spiritual, it is equally true of the sciences. And this is the reason why you will see sometimes inventions, discoveries, theories appearing simultaneously in two different places, two different people. And then they compete, who got it first? No, you copied from me. No, you copied from me. In fact, both got it at the same time. From whom? From nature. When she decided it was time now to introduce this, and suddenly they catch it. And if they didn't catch it, or if they caught it but they didn't take it through to completion, well, nature continues to push that until another receptacle, vehicle is found to catch, who may be not so good, but well, that's all she had. She must push forward her objective. And so you see how, from nature's perspective, there is a time, there is a sequencing. And if an invention appears too soon, she may even use her will to hold it back, to suppress it, or even to bury it. And this also has happened. Sri Aurobindo speaks of two inventions which were premature, I think. He says, speaks of the telephone and cinema, which were premature. You can see how it has been misused and how it could have been better used. Equally, you see things such as the nuclear weapons. We could think of it as premature or maybe just on the borderline. Had it happened 10 years earlier, the outcome of the Second World War would have been very different. But it happened just at the point of the ending of the Second World War. Perhaps even that was a little too early. Misuse was rampant, and the price is still paid today. But had it come a little later, it might have been too late. There's a timing, and nature is as if modulating the interests of people, the minds and hearts through this push. The action of nature within us is something so prevalent, so important, we are not conscious of it, and therefore we don't realize its importance. Not only in the turn of the mind, not only in the turn of interests and ideas, in the term of the heart, in the passion of desires, she chooses. And equally in the physical body. I have given this example before of how nature controls population. It's an interesting observation, studied repeatedly across the world, that the average population of dogs in a city remains constant. And if the government goes out and culls the dogs, it's a nice way of saying takes them out and kills them, population drops, and the surviving dogs give birth to many puppies until the population rises again. Once it stabilizes at a certain number, these dogs give or they become less fertile, and the overall population remains the same. Now, who in the dog decides and controls the fertility? Not the dog, certainly. At the human level, at least we can say, yes, we have chemicals to do that, but the dogs don't. It's nature. She wills to increase the population and the fertility increases. The estrus increases. She wills to reduce population and all these desires drop and the physical biological fertility drops. And you have to understand the implications of this. How far does this go? Think of what it means for human beings. Think of what it means for all of human behavior. Why in certain spaces people turn to develop art, other spaces they develop strength, other spaces they develop knowledge. Why? Because nature chose. And often she chose spaces for an isolated purpose. Japan, Mother refers to as the culture which is intended to be the teacher of beauty for humanity on an island. And that seclusion of the island was necessary. It's one of the very few countries which has never experienced colonization. And then you can see a continuity of traditions, cultures, even family businesses going back 1,000 years. And they retained that. And with it, they could build a deeper, more subtle, more complex culture and art. India similarly was isolated by the Himalayas. To come into India, you had to cross some very difficult passages. And the other side was the ocean, with which it was protected, and which allowed for a certain isolated space in which things could be developed and built up. So there's in nature a certain intention, and even you could say, going back, she builds the physical space on which to develop the human type and the particular qualities of culture and civilization. Interesting. And then when you think of it in those terms, going back a few million years, there is nature's gigantic plan. On Earth, she lifts lands, sinks lands, builds mountains, creates lakes, and all this with a certain purpose. One of the fascinating spaces I saw was in Switzerland, where every mountain or valley has its own variation of dialect. And why? Because it is so snowy, 9 months out of the year, you are snowbound. Of course, now with modern tools, you're crossing the snow more easily. But if you go back nearly 50 years, 9 months of the year you're snowbound, what happens? Local cultures, pockets develop with their dialects. It's almost as if nature has created an opportunity here for a very wide, rich variety of what is otherwise very flat in culture. And what was her purpose? And it's interesting to see very strong village identities, and very protective, very secret in their identities. And you see, one of the characteristics of the Swiss space today is secrecy of banking, for which it is famous. But it comes from that very protective, even I would say narrow sense of identity, which is happy to isolate itself and hold its own and guard a secret. And all the behavior you will find can be traced back to certain geological structures and formations. And so for nature, the psychological later goals have been prepared for by the life energy processes, which have been by the physical processes of the geography, geology. And if you think of her vision when she looks at the future and the way she has formed the earth and unfolding, you see an extraordinary knowledge, extraordinary wisdom, extraordinary patience. And that's why in the earlier paragraph we saw last time, Sri Aurobindo speaks of religion itself has shown its power of survival and is undergoing the final sense of which is still obscure. We can't see, but nature has her purpose of that final sense of where she wants to take these religious forms. So, come back to this sentence. For it is always the individual who receives the intuitions of nature and takes the step forward. So the individual has got it. What happens to the intuition? You take the forward step. That was the purpose of the intuition. Nature's march, of which you are the instrument for the forward step, for which she gives you the intuition. Now again, his word is intuition. He does not use the word instinct or drive or many of the earlier things, the vital instinct and so on. Intuition is different from instinct in this. In the instinct, there is the drive of the passion without knowing why. The animal senses instinctively danger and runs, and a day later there's an earthquake. But he didn't know there's going to be an earthquake. But intuition is a higher operation of the same power, in which first there is the knowledge, and in the knowledge is the impulse to actualize it. I know my life has a purpose, and now immediately my whole being turns now to fill this sense of purpose. And I cannot go back to what I was anymore. It's done. I've changed by the intuition. So the character of the intuition is, as it fills you, it reveals something in knowledge and then changes you from within. You cannot go back to being what you were. And intuition is how the most important steps of evolution are taken in the higher ranges. In the lower ranges, it is the drive of instinct. Animal is primarily instinct. Human is the individual who receives first the intuition and takes the step forward. Now what happens is, this individual is not cut off from the rest of the collective. It may be a small pocket of the collective in the local village, but still takes the step forward, dragging or drawing the rest of humanity behind him. Two words, again suggestive of the manner in which this intuition acts. Nature used the individual to make that change, but because we are all connected in some kind of an underlying sense of human nature, which is really one substance, species consciousness, if we have to reduce it to form. When one individual takes a step forward, the entire substance of the species consciousness is as if pulled a little bit, stretched. So this is the first character, dragging. It drags someone. Another person is now pulled by the drag and now lifted a little bit for the intuition to touch him. And he is also moving forward in the step, dragging, more and more join. There is a famous term used today called the 100th monkey principle. The number 100 is not significant, but it is used because that's for us an important number to describe how a species develops a new habit. And this comes from an experiment in Japan, off the coast of main Japan. There are many small islands and there are many monkeys. Because of the ocean, they are separated. On one island, scientists taught monkeys to wash vegetables in seawater which made them less muddy and salty, so more tasty. The monkeys began to teach each other. Very quickly, they began to enjoy each other. Once that number grew beyond a point, spontaneously, monkeys on other unconnected islands began to wash vegetables in seawater. So what happened there was an individual dragging the rest of his kind, a second and a third, until the pull is great enough that everybody else now is dragged beyond the threshold in which now the consciousness kicks in and the habit comes forward spontaneously. But here's used two words, dragging or drawing. So the first experience is dragging. You're pushed and there is this unintentional pull. The second is when the monkey who's now tasting this shares his more tasty vegetable with another, who tastes it and says, ah, this is different, this is interesting. And he watches. And the first monkey teaches by example, by transmission of experience. Here's something you could try. The second one does it, he enjoys it, and he shares it with the third. And so the second type of pulling is the drawing, a more active, conscious, participatory process. So the dragging is unintentional, where you experience the struggle of the pull, but the drawing people is more conscious. The rest of humanity behind it. And so until there is that change taking place in all eventually. But even if we give the credit, remember all this is part of the discussion. What if the religion emerges from this occultist or the mystic who has received intuition and now teaches? But even if we give credit of this new creation to the subconscious mass mind, it is the occultist and mystic element in that mind which created it. So you could argue that it was not nature doing it. It is the occultist and mystic element in that mind which created it. So you could argue that it was not nature doing it through an individual. It was in the collective mass something woke up, which is reasonable. You see, in the Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo has to deal with every possible counter-argument. So you could have said, yeah, that's the defective theory. It happens spontaneously. Of course, spontaneous is one of those keywords which says, I don't know how, but it happens. So when I say it happens spontaneously, it happened by chance. I don't know how, but that's how it happened. So spontaneously in this subconscious mass mind, there is this emergence of an impulse. And then people get it. So he says, yes, even if we give credit to the subconscious mass mind, it is the occultist and mystic element in that mind which created it, the religion. And it must have found individuals through whom it could emerge. So we come back to that idea. Even if the mass mind wakes up and says, I want this, there has to be an individual through which it gives to it a form. And maybe several individuals at the same time, but still some will be first in some way. And the individuals who would give form would be mystic or occult in their turn of nature. You won't have others who will build this possibility. For a mass experience or discovery or expression is not the first method of nature. Again, we are going back to first principles. Nature does not start with mass change. Suddenly, one morning, everybody wakes up and we are all washing vegetables with seawater. No, it doesn't work like that. It always starts with a few. So it's not nature's first method. First method is one person wakes up and very quickly others catch because they find it interesting. And then the mass moves. It is at some one point or a few points that the fire is lit and spreads from hearth to hearth, from altar to altar. And it's describing nature's method. And so far it's extremely logical, extremely convincing. Hearth from altar to altar. And it's describing nature's method. And so far it's extremely logical, extremely convincing. It is and spreads from hearth to hearth, from altar to altar. Now suddenly we have found truth here. We have seen before in our study, wherever it became symbolic and poetic, there was deep symbolism behind, and we need to pause and see what is this symbol here. It is at some one point or a few points that the fire is lit. First the fire is lit and then spreads. How it spreads we'll see later. First a fire is lit at one point or a few points. Fire. Symbolic, yes, it's like you've lit a fire and you've passed it on. No, the fire here is not just a symbolic fire, it is the true fire within us. Agni, lit a fire and you've passed it on. No, the fire here is not just a symbolic fire, it is the true fire within us. Agni of the Veda. Agni is the human aspiration. And Agni is that which is leading the whole drive of evolutionary journey. Agni in its origin is the divine will entering the darkness of inconscience and working from within the darkness. Darkness covered in darkness is how it is described. And from within that, this is the only God of all the powers of the divine, the only aspect and power which accepts to enter the darkness. All others say we will not lose ourselves in the darkness. We will wait for Agni to build the forms which are well made, then we will enter those forms which are conscious. But it is left to Agni to build the forms. That's why he's also the builder of forms. So he enters the darkness, and from within what is an inchoate mass of random moving subatomic particles with no sense of stable form, he starts working as the hidden divine will, assembles these inchoate, unstable particles, stabilizes them in a pattern which is repeating, internally unstable, but as a whole the atom is stable. If you split the atom, all the subatomic particles are unstable, they keep changing. You bring them together, the atom as a whole is so stable, it takes enormous energy to break it. And when you break it, it releases an enormous energy, which is the energy locked by the divine will working to assemble, to build that single atom. That is the work of Agni. Having built atoms, it builds molecules, it builds more and more complex structures, amino acids, cells, creatures, beings, and so on. The whole creation of form is Agni. But always he's inside it. He was inside the subatomic particle when he formed it. He's inside the being that is formed, as well as the plant or the animal. And it is in the animal that it is Agni secretly who is nudging and pushing as that drive to want, to desire, craving to reach beyond its limited needs, to always extend. And it is Agni which is pushing also as the desire to want to know, to grow in knowledge, to grow in consciousness. So the fire you referred to, which is being lit, now is lit. We're still talking of nature. So nature is lighting the fire. It's as if nature says, here, Agni, give you this. That's the intuition given, and Agni is helped from above or from around by nature, and the urge within, which is still struggling in the blind mass of darkness, gets a bit of a nudge and a help from the intuition. And so the fire is lit, and Agni now grows and a help from the intuition. And so the fire is lit, and Agni now grows and says, yes, this is what I want. So in any experience of knowledge, you will find this aspect of Agni's light coming forward. You notice that when you have a sudden idea, it flashes in you. The light fills your mind for a while, fills your whole being, even if it is a strong intuition. It flashes. And at that point you see, you know, and vividly know. Afterwards, when it passes and the light is gone, you try to remember, you know, at that time I had this idea, it was so brilliant, I knew everything in detail, now I've forgotten it. Because it was never mine, I didn't think it, therefore I don't remember it. It was a light which revealed, and when the light was lost or covered, I don't know it, it's not part of my thinking. So this lighting up of the fire is the normal experience, and it represents a profound truth of how knowledge grows in us. And when the intuition comes, it is as a flash of that light, or a tiny spark of that light before it becomes full intuition, a tiny spark that comes, which is more close to the emergent Agni experience. But Agni itself is described in the Veda as rising towards his own home, which is in the divine consciousness, fully awake and liberated, as a liberated divine will working in form. But here, he's rising. So in between, he's a smoky fire. What's the character of a smoky fire? The smoke covers the fire itself. You see the forest fires? The smoke is what you see. You don't see the fire. You have to see it at night, then you can see the fire because the smoke is, it's as if going through the smoke. But in daytime, you see smoke. It's interesting in the Hebrew tradition, when Moses is brought out of, he's leading his people out of Egypt, he's led by a pillar of fire at night, which is a pillar of smoke in daytime. Interesting. If you take it symbolically, it represents the knowledge which is still too confused and covered up by its own desire and passion. The excitation of knowledge is covering the true core, which is the divine will, which is the light within. And through that, Agni has to grow. That's what you see in animals, that's what you see in primitive man. Through that, it has to grow until the light comes into its own and the smoke is cleared. No more desire and passion driven, but clear, illuminated will, which leads my actions. And so Agni himself is rising, growing in maturity, coming closer and closer to his true nature, true form. So it is at some one point or a few points that the fire is lit and spreads from hearth to hearth, from altar to altar. How is the mechanism of Agni spreading? Hearth to hearth and altar to altar. What is this symbol? And at this point, we're going to look at the physical aspect of the symbol, and the psychological will easily fill in and resonate. What's the hearth? In the way the language originates, it's always in the context of the local culture. And these are English words, so you have to see what happens in England, in Europe generally. Let's take that extreme example, which I mentioned earlier, of Switzerland, where you have 9 months of snow-bound life. What do you do during those 9 months? Well, the 3 months that you had a little bit of sun and plant, you tried to capture and preserve all the food for the winter, and particularly the heating means. So you chop the trees, cut them, arrange them, and during those 9 months you're burning the wood. What if you fell asleep and your fire got burnt out? You don't have a fire, you will die. Very simply. What do you do then? You go to your neighboring house, catch the flame from his hearth, and bring it to your hearth. You see what happens here? Someone has the flame, otherwise we all die out. Together, we all protect the flame so that if a few of us lose it, others will keep it and will reignite it in those who have lost it. So this transmission from hearth to hearth, you see how profound the symbol is. It may start with one person who has the fire, and others come and say, yes, we also want to share this. They take that flame into their homes and light it. And together as a collective, we tend to grow in protecting that intuition, that knowledge, that new awakening in our evolution. And of course, initially it's always unstable. It always gets snuffed out. My wood logs were too soggy, and though they caught flame in one tip, by the time they reached the other end, they burnt out, they lost the flame. And I go back to those who have it to rekindle my heart. Now the heart is so central to the house that even the name of a house is heart. Because without the heart, there is no home. You cannot have life, you cannot have the family. In the physical design of the house, it is put as centrally as possible so that the heat may radiate evenly in all directions. The heart is never placed on one corner because you want the heat not to be lost on the other side of the wall. So the heart is something central, holding the family together, defining even the reality of family. You step out of the house in the middle of the winter because of some necessary work, you come back home to your heart, to the warmth and the safety and the love of the warmth and the protective space of the family and affection. That's heart. And so family is called heart, home is called heart by extension. If you look at the individual, the center within us is that flame of our aspiration, that which holds our entire personality together, and it's at the very core of our personality. Take that out, and you are just a robot. Without that, you are not a human being. You are not even an animal. Even an animal has that flame, even if it is smoky. Take that out, you're just a machine. And bring that back, and that's the spiritual center of your aspiration, the light of the soul, to whatever extent it is able to glow out, filling your entire personality and making this truly a worthwhile home to all the different powers of your psychology. In the Vedic vocabulary, to all the gods who need this center of Agni's light and heat to be able to live together, and he holds, through his aspiration, he holds them in harmony. Their workings are organized around this center, which is the center of our personality, therefore. And that's why spontaneously, when we have to make a gesture in theater or in mime or in casual conversation, when you say I, just put your hand on your chest. I feel, I want, I am. Somehow we feel it here. And so this is that fire, and the spreading from heart to heart. The external symbol of it is this deep, intimate center of the flame of the divine light or love within us. And what happens when we meet each other, now on this psychological level, the heart within kindles the light in another. After meeting him, I was inspired to do the same thing. And when my inspiration flags, I go back to meet him and rekindle the light. And rekindle the light. And this is often the case in the example of a spiritual teacher. People came to Sri Aurobindo or the mother, went back entirely changed. And they came again to rekindle, to renew. I've seen this in so many linear traditions. It doesn't have to be as dramatic. People going even to a temple, it is for that center of that light. There again you kindle the flame for the arati, and the flame often becomes the symbol of the arati, and the flame often becomes the symbol of the whole ritual itself. But you come back to that center to rekindle and go back as if revivified. And that's this transmission from heart to heart, spreads from heart to heart, from a few points or even from one person. Sri Aurobindo points out how what led to the First World War and the Second World War was not the political leaders of that time, but you had to go back a couple of generations to the thinkers a couple of generations ago, who established certain ideals, certain ways of saying, thinking, certain values, which led eventually to the political leaders executing the practical outcome of those values or those philosophies. Nietzsche, for example, and his idea of a Superman as an aggrandized, exaggerated, vital, dominating ego, becomes now the basis of an entire war in which the justification of the war is, here's a superior collective that has therefore the right to dominate an inferior collective. But it was not thought of those people, it was a thought seeded by an individual or a few individuals who shared that thought. But even there was a first and then a collective which quickly formed around it. And so you see this spread from heart to heart, points of light or fire. The other way of spreading, he says, is from altar to altar. What's the difference of an altar and a hearth? So the altar is one way, it is not closed inside at the core of the home, but often a public, open space in which not an individual but a collective forms to participate in a ritual, and so it's a religious ritual involving what? Often involving lighting of a flame and a whole ritual exercise around it, which represents an offering, a consecration, a giving, and a receiving, an interchange, which is made often by a priest on behalf of the group. But the altar is in an open space, is in a larger shared society, not in the intimacy of your home within you. So the altar now becomes symbolically in that collective space, the spaces where individuals come to debate and discuss these new ideas. When there is this idea of a Superman, well, Nietzsche speaks of it to a group of students who are learning from him. They debate, they discuss, they spread, but it is happening in a public space, in a public discourse, not in the intimacy of an inner experience which changes from within. If there has not been the heart experience, there cannot be the altar experience. The altar requires now physical symbol. The altar of, let's say, generalizing it to the temple of democracy is the parliament, isn't it? Symbolic of the whole democratic framework. What is the core on which the whole thing is based? One point where eventually there has to be the gathering and the free expression of thought and sharing. What in the parliament would represent the sense of the altar, the center of it? And it's interesting to see all over the world this pattern has been reasonably common, it has become reasonably common, that there's as if a semicircle, almost a full circle, but there has to be some kind of a central authority who holds the reference for the values held. And then there is the well, a focal point in between. And when people get upset and things are not going the way they should, they all troop into the well and raise the voice saying, this is not functioning the way it should. You see, the sense of the altar somehow physically tends to represent itself, where all of us surround and gather around a point which becomes now the collective aspiration represented, spreading from altar to altar. Where one altar has expressed this, the people go back and they gather again now in a different space, in a different form, a different altar, but this is now the exposed, objectivized spread. So we reread the sentence. For a mass experience or discovery or expression is not the first method of nature. It is at some one point or a few points that the fire is lit and spreads from hearth to hearth, from altar to altar. There's one thing we have glossed over. The mass experience or discovery or expression is not the first method of nature. Please use three words: mass experience, mass discovery, or mass expression. And they represent three degrees in which that intuition or that intention of nature is working in us. When first the intuition dawns in you, settles in you, you have an experience. Oh, this is what it is. This is what they were speaking of. You know in the very character of the experience. Where earlier I didn't understand what they were speaking of. Now it makes sense. It is an individual experience to which you may not have a full sense. I feel a deep peace. I don't know from where it came. From there, it takes the form of a discovery. I feel something and I realize now that this is what they call spiritual presence. This is what they call inspiration. And you give to it an overt, objective terminology, form, idea, or it takes a practice. Discovery, the covering is removed. What was covered, felt subjectively, sometimes subliminally, is now discovered. And now it requires an objectivized form, but within you. And then now it moves to an expression. I articulate in words, in actions, in behavior, in my life. So these are the three stages of any awakening to true knowledge. And even what takes place in the school goes through the same three-step process. That there is first something where you feel, yes, I think I have an idea. And then I'm not sure, let me take a while. I struggle and then I draw out the idea sufficiently, it has got discovered, and then I know what it is I want to express, and I begin to formulate, articulate, or organize in action. So a mass experience or discovery or expression is not the first method of nature, it's always an individual experience, discovery, or expression. But in all this, remember, the goal was the spiritual. So we will read quickly the next two sentences, but we'll continue the text later. But the spiritual aspiration and experience of the mystics was usually cascaded in secret formulas and given only to a few initiates. It was conveyed to the rest, or rather preserved for them, in a mass of religious or traditional symbols. It is these symbols that were the heart's core of religion in the mind of an early humanity. Heart's core of religion. Your heart, that's already the core of your body. And then the core of the heart is this. So it is casketed, protected in the very form of the heart. Casket is the word used for a box in which the most precious jewels are kept. And so the spiritual aspiration and experience of the mystics was usually casketed in secret formulas and given only to a few initiates. Precisely, we saw the reasons for protecting this. What you give to the others, you don't throw away the jewels. In the biblical tradition, they speak of the waste which happens when you throw pearls to swine. Pigs don't value your pearls. They smell it, not interesting. They try to bite it, not tasty. But the human mind, which has an aesthetic sense, will value the pearls. So if you have to give only to those who will value. If you give to somebody who does not have the competence or the value or the worthiness to appreciate, it's a waste. In the yoga tradition, this is described as adhikara bheda. Adhikara is the competence, the distinction of competence. Adhikara is the competence, the distinction of competence. Distinction. Kinds of higher knowledge which cannot be appreciated, should not be, cannot even be given. If you were to give it, they would just discard or pervert it. So you have to protect, you don't have a choice. And that's why the adhikara bheda becomes the reference in the yoga tradition for the deeper aspects of any knowledge which is shared. So it was conveyed to the rest, or rather preserved for them in the vast of religious or traditional symbols. And this is what you will see in so much of the Vedic knowledge. It is these symbols that were the heart's core of religion in the mind of an early humanity. So the symbols have captured a deep truth. It is held, cascaded, and somewhere deep inside, that's what you hold at that stage of early humanity. But later, there will be an attempt in the next stage. Out of this second stage, there emerge a third stage, which is the next paragraph, where these symbols are attempted to be drawn out and to be shared with the larger humanity. And with maybe certain prescriptions given, certain conditions taught, that don't do this prematurely, take the first steps and then the second and the third and so on. What happens then? How does the religion grow subsequently? And what was the actual evidence in human development? That we will see next Sunday. So for now, we will just reread this the most important sentence which we dwelt upon and recognize its value for us. That in our own lives, the fire is lit and spreads heart to heart and from altar to altar. And this is the great importance of the satsanga, the shared collective immersion in the spiritual atmosphere, learning from each other, or the lighting of the fire, or the protecting the fire in the collectivity of the village or the community, so that if in one it is extinguished, he can get back that warmth back from the others. And it is how we build the spiritual collective, the spiritual community, which then starts at as many small parts, available to all, even if each one begins with their own particular aspect or affinity. So it is on some one point or a few points that the fire is lit and spreads from hearth to hearth, from altar to altar. We can meditate on this for half a minute.
Because it was outside.